Well, I'm going to take a broad perspective, moving in a variety of directions, to ask whether time is a dynamic force or a passive passage. I'm going to ask whether anthropology should take for granted that time is a dimension tied to space, whether anthropologists would benefit analytically by treating time in its own right, and whether this might indicate whether time might be a dynamic force rather than a passive passage. Then I want to turn to a Native American shaman, who lived through different premises of existence than my own, and who may have healed with time. From the onset of its modern formation in the early 20th century, social cultural anthropology has addressed the problem of the existence and shape of time among the peoples of its ethnographic study. In doing this, anthropologists have generally used our own common sense understanding of time as the explicit and implicit basis for comparison. For someone like myself growing up in rural Canada during the 1940s and 50s, it was taken for granted that time is movement, that this movement is linear, chronological, and divisible, that there are 4 dimensions, 3 of space, 1 of time, but that time is felt and perceived as subjective and therefore as variable, even as it is measured objectively and exactly. For us, this was practical time and practice time. The only real time was objective and measured the passages from past to present, and so whether anything had changed during these intervals. This reckoning of time is what I am calling time as a passive passage. We pass through time through what we as human beings, though we as human beings are not made or shaped by time as such. We and everything else are shaped by other forces, biological, social, cultural, and we use time to measure and evaluate these forces. Time is a passive passage, a pliant medium through which interaction occurs, yet time is not accountable for the interaction itself that depends on forces understood as not dependent on time as such. The philosopher Elizabeth Grosz calls such time a neutral medium in which matter and life are framed rather than as a dynamic force in the framing itself. And as the historian H.W. Brands comments, Einstein did not say that space-time really had 4 dimensions. What he said was that it was convenient for human beings to think of space and time as a 4-dimensional continuum in order to measure the universe, or to try to do this. Nonetheless, the common sense acceptance of time as the 4th dimension still dominates the study of the anthropology of time. But if time exists, and if time is always moving, should we not consider time as dynamic rather than as a frozen, immeasurable dimension of space, as the physicist Lee Smolin puts this? The philosopher Jean Gebser argued that time is not a dimension. In other words, not a measure of division, but an amention, an element free from division and measurement, a basic phenomenon without spatial character. Perhaps it is the very movement of amensional time that is dynamic in the forming of living. To paraphrase Henri Bergson, time exists to prevent everything from happening at once, yet to enable everything to happen. In this way, it is time that enables difference to exist and to generate further difference through time. The ways in which time moves seems to be critical to questions of ontology. If there is a multiplicity of cultural ontologies, as there likely is, then perhaps time too is not a singular medium of passive passage that is always the same, even though it is interpreted differently. Perhaps time is a multiplicity of temporalities that work differently through the ontological premises of other cultures, influencing how their realities are configured and how these move. In my view, this is the most difficult of questions that an anthropology of time can take up, and moreover, one to which there may well be no answer. I met the Native American shaman and healer, Henry Rupert, over 50 years ago. The Washoe people, of whom he was one, lived in an area of Nevada called the Great Basin, an arid plateau with relatively few natural foodstuffs. The traditional Washoe Cosmos was a world continually in movement. This movement was that of power that filled cosmos, and power had a strong affinity to the life energy of all beings. This was a fluid cosmos. Bergson, and later Michel Serres in his book Statues, and probably others as well, have commented that our own metaphysics are those of the solid, of the very thingness of the solid, and of the movement between times of rest and stability, movement that is distinguished clearly from the solid. The fluidity of the Washoe Cosmos was associated strongly with the fluidity of water, while power was intrinsically attracted to water and flowed along waterways, though also along trails. This was a living cosmos, and all of its elements and beings were strongly interactive. In Henry's reality, all beings, all flora, all fauna required water in order to live. Water flowed with life, life flowed with water. Water was the duration of life. To which I add the following, that water was time. If the duration of water was disrupted, then life fell ill. Duration was disrupted when life was dried out, and life energy failed before the conclusion of its natural lifespan. This often occurred when a person inadvertently, accidentally, failed to provide water to the life force of another organic entity, whether human or not, for which that person was responsible. In response, the dried out entity took the water it needed from the person responsible, drying out this person, who then fell ill. To put this a little differently, life faltered when its own time, its water, was taken from it. Henry's healing solution was often to ensure that water and time would return to both of the afflicted. I think I can say that Henry worked with entropy. This is to say that he healed with time. The reduction of water in an organic being increased its entropy and reduced the duration of its internal time. Without the ongoing movement of time, the condition of the inflicted became increasingly indeterminate. Healing involved restoring the life force of the person by replenishing water, by replenishing the person's internal time. In order to heal these conditions, Henry had to make the ill person self-reflexive about his responsibility for the condition of illness. Self-reflexivity is a turning into oneself. In a sense, a returning to a previous time when the person was actually making the error of desiccating another being. Here, self-reflexivity has the potential to become an act of renewal. Now, the physicist Ilya Prigozhin argued that the time of the universe is linear, and that it is this very linearity that results in time that is open-ended and indeterminate, with futures unknown. For if time curves, then correcting the past becomes possible, and so the future may become deterministic. This possibility Prigozhin rejected. But he argued that with the increase of entropy, the time of the universe moved into conditions of far from equilibrium, and that under these conditions, the linearity of time became variable. Moreover, he insisted that life is possible only in a non-equilibrium universe. The emergence and evolution of organic life is not possible in a determinate physical universe, and we live in conditions far from equilibrium. It is these conditions that enable the reproduction of organic life forms. Organic reproduction is the movement of time that is negentropic, interning reflexively, moving back into dynamics that will re-energize and recreate the organism. Yet during this temporal movement of interning towards repetition, the organism continues to move forward in time as a linear progression. This suggests that there is always a time lag, even if it is very, very tiny, between the progression of physical time and the reflexive regeneration that is organic time. And perhaps this gap opens to the potentiality for change in the organism from generation to generation. I have suggested that in Henry Rupert's healing, the replenishment of life energy and the replenishment of time were one and the same. But was time simply malleable, simply passive, to be manipulated by the healer? Or was time dynamic, enabling or even making something happen in the healing process? Let me note another ethnographic detail here. The first spirit helper that Henry acquired was that of water itself. In Henry's healing, he would pray to water for the well-being of the patient, asking that the aggrieved being, dried out and dying, agree to stop dehydrating the patient in return for receiving water from the patient. The time that is water acted to help replenish the time duration of the patient's life. Here, time was hardly a neutral passage that healer and patient passed through. Time was life-giving. Indeed, time in itself was a force, as of course it may be in the reproduction of the organic. Initially, Henry Rupert did traditional Washoe healing. A healing ritual consisted of the shaman working for 3 consecutive nights, from dusk to midnight, and the 4th night from dusk until the dawn of the following day. The same ritual acts were repeated during each night. Night after night, the ritual had a rhythmic pulsation, with each lengthy repetition augmenting and intensifying ritual intentionality. And then into the dawn of the 4th day, when the shaman would by then have a better idea of whether or not the victim agreed to cease drawing out the patient. Later on, Henry acquired a second spirit helper, and this was a young Hindu whose skeleton stood in a local high school. Though he continued to do traditional healing, Henry began to see himself differently during a healing ritual. He would see himself as a skeleton wearing a turban, moving quickly around the body of the patient. Henry's own being during the ritual had changed. He had introduced the potential of speedier time into his healing. His own interior velocity speeded up with the augmentation of life energy that the Hindu had brought him. Many years later, when Henry was about 70 years old, he healed a Hawaiian curer. In return, the Hawaiian gifted Henry with some of his own power in the form of a Hawaiian spirit helper named George, who lived in a volcano in Hawaii. George brought Henry new healing techniques, together with the following maxims. Everything comes quick and goes away quick, and we help nature and nature does the rest. Now, for problems, for ailments easier to cure, Henry could dispense with visions of diagnosis and visions of prognosis, with chants and many other elements of the 4-night healing ritual. The healing ritual now took between 10 minutes and 4 hours and involved praying to George and the placing of hands on the patient to remove pain from the body. Now, the rhythm of pulsation and repetition was omitted in many cases, while the speed and velocity of the ritual increased greatly. Washoe cosmology and the energy of time as water were largely excised. Moreover, the patient was depersonalized, since there was no need to establish causation through errors of omission and commission. Through the emphasis on speed and velocity, time came more fully to the forefront as the dynamic that enabled Hawaiian healing. Today, I think of Henry experimenting, not deliberately or purposively, but experimenting with the potentialities of time, though he never mentioned them as such. Nonetheless, I think he was drawn to the potential dynamic of the movement of time. Initially, in his healing practice, time was contextualized through the movement of water as life energy. Time in his healing ritual was repetitive, pulsating, and finally often climactic. Eventually, through the Hawaiian healing of George, contextualization disappeared, and non-pulsating time, closer perhaps to the sheer movement of time, came to the fore. This increase of speed and time that was non-pulsed became more the dynamic of movement in his healing. But he gave little or no regard to the patient as subject. He was disinterested now in the cause of pain, disinterested in the errors made by the patient, and so forth. In Henry's world, time was not a passive passage, but an active force. The message seems clear. Change time, change the dynamic of time. So, without changing time, there is no change in the dynamic of time. But of course, this is as clear as mud. Once, when he and I were talking about shamanism, his shamanism, he told me very straightforwardly, what is real for me is not real for you. I was not surprised, but I was nonetheless nonplussed. What was the significance of this statement? It did not single out one of our realities as objective and true, and the other as subjective, and if not untrue, then misguided or deluded. He seemed to be telling me that we really lived in different worlds, but differences that were not simply the result of different interpretations of the same world, but that different worlds indeed existed and moved through themselves differently. We lived in different ontologies, different cosmologies, with different basic premises of existence and everything that followed from that. I myself lived time more as the fourth dimension, more as a passive passage. He often lived time as Gebser's amentional time, as a force for dynamic movement. Do we live on an earth of multiple ontologies? Probably we do. And is the movement of time a major force in this multiplicity? Likely it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. Questions, please. You overwhelmed them.
No, not, there will be questions. Start anywhere.
Thank you. I'm always reminded of that 19th century classic Flatland, to understand how we can approach time as a fourth dimension, which we can only move in linearly. Like a two-dimensional being has only a vague perception of up and down. And it's led, not just by me, but by others, to contemplating the God concept as moving, as existing, its existence as being in the fourth dimension, knowing the past, knowing the future, etc. To what extent did the shaman reach some understanding of that in terms of both the two-dimensionality of time?
Well, for one, he did not have a God concept. He lived in a cosmos, as many peoples do around the world, of a organic cosmos, which means not only a living cosmos, but that a cosmos that is self-sustainable. Self-sustainable also suggests that there is no, well, how shall I put it? The organic cosmos that sustains itself does not, in principle, have an outside. In other words, there is no room for a monotheistic God that, as it were, holds cosmos together, but is not a part of that cosmos, not fully a part of that cosmos. Can enter, can leave injunctions, can be sorrowful if cosmos is not behaving as it should in his own, according to his own injunctions and so forth. No, the deity or deities are an integral part of cosmos, which means that there is no absolute distinction between them and between, as it were, their people. So he lives in, or lived in an organic cosmos, where the cosmos itself, and by the way, this is no less true for at least the Shaiva cosmos of modern Hinduism, say the last 500, 600 years. The cosmos has to supply all of everything that the cosmos needs in order to survive. This means that everything is very tightly interconnected. This means that that hierarchy is not exactly a basic principle of organizing this. There are gradations, but actually, as in modern Hinduism, God and human being can almost change positions, at least since the beginnings of the Bhakti movement in India. So I don't really have an answer to your question. As far as something like flatland goes, it's worth taking a look at Mobius strip. It's worth taking a look at the Klein bottle. It's worth thinking about, in each of these cases, the number of dimensions are limited, and it requires a change of perspective in order to appreciate, for example, that in a so-called Mobius strip, if one is inside the strip, and there's no distinction between inside and outside in a Mobius strip, because inside becomes outside, outside becomes inside continuously. If you're inside a creation of that kind, you can't tell the difference if you're inside or outside. So how many dimensions are involved in something like that?
Thank you very much. The video thing that will go on and on.
Thank you very much.